All right, welcome back to another video in our AZ-801 video series. Uh, Today we're going to be in the monitoring and troubleshooting section of the exam, focusing specifically on the objective for troubleshooting Active Directory. And I will say a lot of the stuff we've gone over already in videos is some of it, the content is not things that I work with every day. The stuff I've studied back when I was doing my MCSA 2012 exam, but in an enterprise, you only work with some of this technology on a limited basis. So it is nice today to be back in a video and a topic and content that I am familiar with. This is all stuff that I've done either in my job today or have experience with doing in MSPs and stuff that I'm intimately familiar with. So Active Directory, kind of lifeblood of IT in my experience. It's nice to be back here, and we're going to take a look at some of the exam specific objectives. So in this video, I'm going to be focusing on AD related stuff. You got it on the screen here. We're going to show you how to enable Active Directory Recycle Bin, which will take about 3 seconds because it's really simple. You have Directory Services Restore Mode, or DSRM. That's used to restore components of your Active Directory database in case of failure. We're going to talk about what that looks like. We'll walk through it in video because I have a lab environment so I can break things. We are going to do a little bit of look at replication troubleshooting, and as part of that, a lot of replication related stuff is related to Active Directory sites and services. There is a component if you're only using one site of just replication between DCs, but I'm going to walk through mostly the repadmin command and some basic troubleshooting there. But I'll also be walking through the setup of AD sites and services and different sites so you can kind of see what that involves, because they're definitely related. We're also going to take a side note and talk about replication delay and how to fix that between sites. So that's going to be a good topic to have just generally. I'll call that out specifically in the description if you want to go right to that. And then finally, we are going to be talking about the objective, the exam objective, which just says troubleshoot on-premise AD. That's really vague, but I think that generally just refers to using the dcdiag command, because that's pretty verbose and kind of like the first tool you go to if you're having general AD issues and need to figure out what's going on. So we'll take a look at that. With that, that's the topics. Let's jump right in. It's going to be a pretty easy and straightforward video today, I think. So let me cut over to my remote desktop session here. This is my management server. It's been pretty normal through the labs. I also have an RDP session open to Active Directory P1, and I have stood up, or I've installed the Active Directory domain services role on the server, because this is going to be, actually, sorry, P2. This is going to be my secondary domain controller. I have this set up on a separate VNet and a separate subnet so that I could emulate different sites, but also potentially break the VNet and cause replication issues, though I don't actually need to because I kind of see some of those already. So the reason I have this up, and we're going to start here really quick, I'm going to talk really quick about an important part of DSRM, and then I'm going to cut over, I'm going to show quick how to do the Active Directory Recycle Bin, and then I'll come back to this. But I wanted to stop here and show you this first because I have to restart the server anyways. So if I go to my menu up here, it says there's post config for promoting a domain controller, right? You have to do the actual promotion step. So I wanted to run through this really quick in the DSRM context. I'm going to add to my existing domain. Next. This is the part that I want to talk about. In Active Directory, every Active Directory server has a DSRM password. So when you promote the domain controller, you're always prompted to enter a password. And this is only something you have to do once when you promote it. And oftentimes it's really easy to forget what that password is. So I just wanted to show this is where the password comes from. So if you're doing any sort of DSRM recovery after the fact and you didn't save this password, it's possible to reset it. But I just wanted to demonstrate this is where you initially set it. A lot of people forget about it because it's only something you have to do once, right? So I'm just going to click through the rest of this, ignore errors because this will work. This should still work. It's a little goofy because I have my DNS pointed to my domain controller and then my secondary pointed to public DNS, which causes some issues, but I should be good from here. Yeah. So I'm going to install that. It's going to restart itself. Let's cut back over and I will look at doing the Active Directory Recycle Bin. So that's going. Back on my management server here, and I'm going to pull up for Active Directory Recycle Bin. It has to be the Active Directory Administrative Center, aka ADAC. You can't do this from the old school or the traditional Active Directory users and computers console, which I think a lot of people use for just about everything. ADUC. This doesn't work. The Recycle Center has to be in this ADAC console. So open this up, and like I said, really easy. I click to open my domain, and on here on the right, you have a Enable Recycle Bin button. Now, I could do this. There's also the option to run this via command. Let me pull up my notes really quick. Of course, I didn't save the command. I believe the PowerShell command is, I got to notice that it's restarting because it's being promoted. I'm going to minimize that. The PowerShell command is enable AD optional feature, and then Active Directory Recycle Bin is the command. They have to specify scope and forest. I'm not going to look it up because I didn't save it, but I'll click that button. It tells you, are you sure you want to perform this? Because once it's enabled, you can't disable it. That's fine. Hit OK. And it's begun enabling Recycle Bin. This initiates a command, adds the backend components required to make this work, and it should be good in a second. If I refresh this, now this option is grayed out, and you'll notice I have a deleted objects container. This acts as your recycle bin, so if things get deleted, that's where they show up. Now, to demonstrate this, also really easy. Whoops. Let's go to my other console. Go to People, and I'm going to get rid of Mr. Wilson. Sorry, Mr. Wilson. He's now gone. And if I go back to here, this is another thing I'll call out. Just like you had to go to the ADAC to enable Recycle Bin, you also have to use this console to get to the deleted objects OU. There is a way to recover these with PowerShell, but it can be kind of difficult, kind of fluky. And I will say this gets really complicated if you have thousands and thousands of deleted objects, because you end up having to use these filters to filter down the deleted objects in order to find the ones to recover, because by default it only displays, I don't know, a couple thousand. So if you have more than that limit, you have to use filters to get to identify stuff to restore. That can also get kind of if you're using PowerShell to restore, you run into limitations if you have a lot. So if you're in a really big domain, this workflow is kind of difficult. Either way, I'm in ADAC where I have to be. I can open deleted objects, the container, and there you go. I have E. Wilson, the user I deleted, and to restore him, I can right-click, restore. I have the option to restore him to a different OU if I want to, but I'm just going to go ahead and restore him. I go back here, refresh, there he is. That's a recycle bin. Very simple, very useful feature. I don't know why you wouldn't turn it on. I definitely recommend it. So that's the recycle bin portion. Now let's go back and we looked at the DSRM password. So let's go back and look and run through a DSRM restore really quick. I'm going to connect to my P2 server here. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up a document on the side to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. I will link this document in the description so you can do the same thing if you're wanting to. But the first thing you usually do, am I in my, no, there, okay. I had to make sure I was in my P2 desktop. The first thing you normally have to do if you're doing a DSRM restore is you have to reset the DSRM password. Because, like I said, you set it once when you're promoting a domain controller and usually you forget it. You can set the DSRM password on a per DC basis, or it is a per DC basis. It's tied to the domain controller computer object, so it doesn't work for each one. You have the option to either reset it on the current computer you're on or reset it on another domain controller from a different domain controller if you need to. But to do that and all of our DSRM stuff, you have to use an application, command line based, called ntdsutil. So wait for this to load. So yeah, the first thing I'll show you here when this comes up is to reset the password. So I'm going to open this to target this computer. I would do reset password. I'm sorry. The first command is set DSRM password. It says there, and then you either it's going to be reset password on, and you're targeting either this computer or a different computer. In this case, I'm going to target this computer. So let's do reset password on server null, which null means this computer, and then type the new password. and now Q to exit, exit, and there you go. So that's how you set the DSRM password. Usually this is going to be the first step you have to do, because most people, sometimes you don't have the password, or the password is saved somewhere and you don't know where it is. So this is kind of the simplest first step. The next portion of restoring DSRM, or doing a DSRM restore to recover a corrupt database, I've used this to there was an instance where I had a client where their domain controller died and the server that was on was physical. We had access to the hard drive, but we didn't have, the server itself could not be recovered. There's some conflict like that. I don't remember the exact details, but I had to do a DSRM restore. Now, there's a couple of different components to DSRM. You can do an authoritative restore, where essentially what it does is it reloads every object from the database you're targeting, and then sets, there's an attribute that Active Directory uses for replication that essentially indicates how many times that object has been changed. And whatever domain controller has the highest number on that object is considered the source of that object. So to illustrate this, let's say I am in Active Directory and I'm resetting the password of that E. Wilson user, right? The guy who I just deleted. If I reset his password, that change number increments by 1. Now the domain controller that processed that reset password things has a higher number of that change value than all the other domain controllers. So now other domain controllers will see, oh, your value is higher, let me get that replication, or let me replicate that data from that user that you have, so that all of the domain controllers in your environment will have an up-to-date password for that user. That's kind of a loose way of describing how Active Directory processes attribute changes, or attribute updates, or object changes in general. When you're doing a DSRM restore, what it does is it takes all of your objects from the database you're restoring, if it's a complete authoritative restore of everything, and it will increment all of those numbers to the highest number and then restore that database. And now when that server comes online with its restored DSRM database, it's now looked at as every other DC that's online sees it and says, oh, you have the most up-to-date information for everything. I'm going to start replicating that data everywhere across all the domain controllers in your environments. That's how it becomes authoritative. Now, that's a description of everything, probably a little bit more detail than you care about, but to actually perform the restore, the first thing we have to do is set it into DSRM recovery mode. Now, a lot of instructions online will tell you restart the computer, start mashing the F8 button when it's booting. That's the old school way of doing it. You can do that. You can also modify a certain INI file to designate that you want to boot into a certain mode. Otherwise, the easiest way to do it, if you have graphical or GUI access to the server, is right-click, run, and you can do this from server core as well. So you don't have GUI access, but you have access to the server. Go to msconfig, which is normally how you'd boot into like safe mode if you're on a desktop. Go to boot, and then under the safe mode, if it's a domain controller, you have this special option called Active Directory Repair. So I'm going to check this box. Part of the reason I'm also doing it this way is because I'm running an Azure VM, and by default, Azure VMs, you can't access them while they're in the boot screen. You don't have access until it gets to the OS. So I have to do it this way. So I'm going to apply, hit OK, and then I'm going to restart the server. And now I'm going to get kicked from this remote desktop session, but I can reconnect. And I'll reconnect, it'll be in safe mode, and we'll show you that. So this shouldn't take very long, and while it's going, I'm going to pull up my other command reference here. Okay, and let's go ahead and try and reconnect real quick. And this might load a little bit slower because it's safe mode. And you can see up in the top right corner here, it says safe mode, safe mode. We're in the AD services restore mode. As long as I'm booted to that, the next thing I have to do is pull up a command prompt, because DSRM essentially uses the ntdsudo command that we use to reset the password to do the rest of its operations. So let's type in ntdsudo, and that will launch into the command line utility. If I'm curious about what commands are available to me here, it's really easy to list everything. I can either do a question mark, I think, or I can type help. And this will list all of the available sub-commands you can use at this command line interface. So question mark shows the help information, right? I have activate instance, authoritative restore, which is what we're going to do in this case. And then you have a couple other just back-end Active Directory maintenance things you have access to with ntdsutil. It is kind of like a Swiss Army knife component, though. If you have to use this, usually you're in a situation that is kind of obscure. So I'm not going to go through all these options, but typing help shows you the commands. Now, I want to do an authoritative restore, right? So let's type authoritative restore. And it's not going to work. So the first thing it says is you have to set an active instance. The instance is going to be, I believe, the instance of the database. And let's go up to the help menu and see what it says. It says set NTDS or a specific AD-LDS instance. Now, if you're not familiar with AD-LDS, that's Lightweight Directory Services. That is, if you have an Active Directory database, you can use LDS to mount that database and access the objects or the resources that are in that database. It's essentially like an explorer, a file explorer for your Active Directory database if you have a backup copy that you're loading from somewhere else. In this case, NTDS means set your current working database in Active Directory, which is what I'm going to use because it's easy, right? So I type in activate instance NTDS. Activate instance NTDS. Sets my active instance, and now hit up twice to go back to my authoritative restore. And I'm now in the authoritative restore prompt. Now, what do I enter here? Help, and it shows you a command. So you've got your help command. You can restore individual objects. You can restore objects and then override the version increase. The version increase is that attribute that says determines which domain controller has the highest number of or the most recent change to that object. Man, struggling with saying that out loud. Or I can do restore subtree, and this will authoritatively restore an entire subtree, an entire directory in that database. Now, if I need to figure out what directories are available or what I can restore, I have got this list command, list NCCRs, which lists partitions and cross-refs. Man, struggling to top. So let's do that first. List NCCRs. Let's see what my objects are that I can restore. And I've got 5. These are very standard Active Directory partitions. You've got schema, configuration. I've got my root domain itself. I have DNS zones and DNS zones for forest and domain. Pretty straightforward. Now, if I'm doing a full domain restore, this is the partition I want. So I'm going to look at doing this command, restore subtree, and %s is the name of the partition I want to set. So let's do that. Make this bigger so I can see my command reference. Restore subtree, and I could copy and paste, but let's just type it out. DC equals dzab, comma, DC equals local, enter. Are you sure you want to perform this? This is that authoritative restore, meaning it's going to restore everything from my working directory, increment all of the version numbers, and now it will come online as saying, I have the most recent copy of the database, everybody else replicate for me. This is going to go really, really quick because I have a small database, but that's it. So that's how you'd perform a DSRM authoritative restore of your AD database if you had it from a backup. Obviously, you'd have to find the LDS instance, the database instance that you want from backup, but that's what you're targeting when you do that activate instance command. And once they're there, hit Q, hit exit. We're done with this, and then the last thing you have to do is just boot back into normal mode. So go back to boot. I'm going to go back, uncheck the safe boot, hit apply, and then I will restart, and our DSRM restore is now complete. I probably should have modified an object or something, but it doesn't matter. I only have 2 domain controllers, the lab instance, and I wouldn't have changed any attributes, so there we go. So our next process in this troubleshoot AD, or the next topic that I wanted to go through, is AD replication troubleshooting. Now, I mentioned when I was going through the intro of this video, I was going to do some Active Directory sites and services. If you are not familiar with Active Directory sites and services, this is a menu that it's not something you go into all the time. It's something you really only have to go into once in a while. But this is where you define if you have multiple physical sites and you want to control the duration or the interval or the cost of replication between those sites, you can set up the sites in Active Directory sites and services, and then you have control over replication information. So by default, if you've never been in here before, you have one site. It's called default first site name, and it's very vague. And if I want to, I can rename this, which I'm going to. So let's say my first site, my main office, is in New York. Now, what you also have under a site are the domain controllers associated with that site. If everything is in one site, this whole console, all of sites and services, isn't really being used. It doesn't really matter. You're not doing any replication between sites, so the clients don't really care about it. But the second you create multiple sites, there's a back-end process that starts trying to associate your clients with their closest domain controller using the information you're setting up in this console. Now, I mentioned this is used if you have like multiple physical offices and you're controlling replication. It's also used by defining subnets in here. You specify what network subnets are associated with which sites, and that also has the added benefit of saying any clients that are on those subnets use the domain controller that you have defined in that site. So it tries to keep replication or authentication traffic local to the physical locations that you have defined. So we're going to create a second site. I'm going to, for the sake of demo, we're going to call it Chicago. Like, let's say we have one office in New York, one office in Chicago. You specify the IP site link, which is some of your replication traffic. We'll talk about that in a second. And then hit OK. And it creates the site. And now, by default, I have no servers in here. And I have one subnet. Or I have one other site that's got my other two servers. The next thing I want to do is define the subnets. I have none created by default, but this will tell my clients how to associate with the site they're in. So I have two Azure subnets. I have 10.0.0. This is my VNets in Azure /16. If you're wondering about how VNets are configured, there's a video about that. Go watch it. And I specify the subnet, and I pick the site it's associated with. In this case, it's going to be New York. Now, my other VNet that I created for my ADP2 server is a 10.1.0.0/16. So that subnet is now going to be associated with, oops, I picked the subnet, Chicago. And because I've associated this subnet with Chicago, I want to move my ADP2 server to my Chicago site. Now, what happens in the back end, the second you set this up, any client that needs to use your domain controllers is going to look at first what subnet am I on, where does my specific IP address map to, and what domain controller should I use. If I'm on the 10.0.0/16 network, I'm going to use ADP1. If I'm on the 10.1.0.0 network, I'm going to use ADP1 or P2, and it's going to automatically send traffic. This will not interfere. It does not prevent clients on the 10.0.0 network or the New York network from hitting a server or a domain controller specified in Chicago. It will still work, but it's always going to prefer the site that it's in. There's also a different log, and I can't remember what the log name is called, but there's a log that starts becoming generated that says, essentially, if a client is on a subnet and talking to your domain, and that subnet has not been defined in AD sites and subnet, it will start tracking entries and saying, hey, I'm getting hits from clients in this subnet that's not defined. I don't know where to go. So if you set this up, you do have to start paying attention to that log and make sure your subnets are defined, because that log will continue to populate. So there is a little bit of checking and maintenance that goes into this. The other part of this, and this goes back to the replication topic that we're talking about, troubleshooting replication, is the second you set up sites, replication between domain controllers is no longer instantaneous. Typically, if everything is in the same site, a change is made to one domain controller, it instantly starts replicating to other domain controllers as they're available, right, as they're checking. If you're doing it if you have multiple sites set up, you can look at what the replication settings are. Go into properties, and oops, that's not where it is. Intersites transports. There we go. Now, when I set the sites, I picked what my IP site link is going to be, and this is the default one. You can create multiple. So if I had 3 sites, I could have 2 site links between them, or 3 different site links that each has its own cost and has its own replication delay. And this is how you actually control how often you need to replicate between them. Now, replication is not like super, it's not a lot of data, but it is bandwidth heavy. especially if you're in a really large organization. So if you don't have big pipes and you're worried about consuming bandwidth, sometimes there's a reason to lower the replication, especially if you've got like an office in New York and an office in China, and it doesn't matter that those objects are ever replicated instantaneously, you can afford a delay. But in our case, I have a lab environment. I want things to replicate instantly. So let's leave the cost as is, and let's say I want to replicate every 1 minute. Look at this. Your minimum value, the default is every 3 hours replicate. So if you stand this up, your replication delay is going to be massive. But if I try to lower this to 1, it says, nope, you have to enter a value between 15 and a really high number. That means your most frequent value that you can replicate as soon as you set up Active Directory sites and services is 15 minutes. Now, this is really important to know if you're using sites and services. And sites and services is a really good service, but you're going to encounter replications. So if you're doing like what we have at in my office at work, we have different sites that are in different cities, but they're in the same state. Now, the delay between those, there's no reason I need any sort of delay in replication. And really, our satellite offices could be using any domain controller. So it doesn't really make sense for us to have a replication delay, or that's going to be a problem if a user calls the service desk, they reset a password, on a domain controller in one site, and that user is trying to authenticate to a different site, and now there's a 15-minute delay. That's never going to work. We do have sites and services, though, because we want to be able to control traffic to domain controllers loosely, and we want that ability, especially we're not using it much right now, but if we want to ever expand that ability, or like shift to the cloud and try and keep cloud authentication traffic designated to the cloud, I would want to use this. So there's a reason to, even if I'm in a close geographical proximity with my domain controllers. So what's the solution? The solution is there's a backend property that you can use to set replication to be instant. Now this is called configuring change notification. So let me pull up another document here and I'll walk us through how to get to that. All of these documents are going to be in the description below as well. So you can reference that if you need to set this up. Now, to set change notification, I cannot do it from my Active Directory Sites and Services console because it's literally setting a backend attribute related to this replication object in AD. So I'm going to have to open ADSI edit. If you've never used ADSI edit, the one thing you want to be aware of is this is a very potent tool, and it's also very possible to break your entire environment if you do crazy things in here. This is how you do things like modify a schema. If you want to add an attribute to a user object, you use ADSI edit to do it. But be careful. Everything in here should be done with intention. You shouldn't be in here just monkeying around. First thing I'm going to do is connect to my configuration context. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this stuff because, to be honest, if you are doing something on purpose, you should know why you're doing it, and you should have instructions up on how to do it. So we're going to go to my configuration context. I want to go to sites because that's where the information for sites and services is stored. I'm going to go to my intra-site transports, and on the site link, because remember, this site link represents the connection between my Chicago and New York offices because that's what I've designated in the settings. I'm going to go to properties. And on here, if I go to options, right now there's nothing set, but this is where you set change notification, and it's really easy. All I do is change this to 1. I hit OK, I hit apply, and now any replication between domain controllers is instant. So let me connect to both my domain controllers. While that's loading, oops, ADP1, let's go to ADP2, open Active Directory users and computers. Let's go to people. E. Wilson is going to be our target for today. Emma. Sorry, Emma, you're getting changed and deleted all over the place. This is a user. Let's update a description. Hit apply. That description is live now on my ADP2 domain controller, which is in our Chicago site. And if change notification worked, if I go back over to ADP1 and I open Active Directory users and computers, it should have now synced replicated instantly, or as instantly as it takes users and computers to open. People? Not yet. There is a delay. All right. So, let's see. I don't know if I need to restart or propagate this or something, but either way, that should trigger eventually. Awkward. That leads us to our next step, which is sometimes you will need to troubleshoot this replication. Actually, before I go on to it, one more note about this AD sites and services. By default, it creates what are called these NTDS settings. Now, NTDS settings involve your links where basically Active Directory is figuring out where does this server replicate from? What are its replication partners? If you have multiple domain controllers, you will see a list of different replication partnerships in here. In this case, I'm in my ADP1 server, and I see it's generating replication from ADP1, right? If I go to this, it's going to probably say the opposite. Or it's not replicating from anywhere. Weird. There we go. ADP1, right? So ADP1 replicates from ADP2. P2 replicates from P1. Makes sense because there's only 2 domain controllers. It's kind of necessary. The way these are generated is using something called a knowledge consistency checker, KCC for short. The KCC generates this automatically, and in most cases, you don't want to modify this. You want to let it do its job, let it figure out its own replication partners, and let it handle and create replication. Active Directory is smart. It's good at handling replication. Let it do its job. In some instances, you may, if in really advanced environments, you might modify these and manually set them. If you manually set them, that change notification attribute we just set will not work. Not out of the box, at least using default settings. However, the settings to correct that are in the instructions that I will link. They're in the portal, the same instructions I used to set this. So there are ways around it, but generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, let KCC generate these replication partners. Don't mess with it yourself. It'll make your life simpler. Now, if I'm troubleshooting replication, if it's not working the way I expect it to, and I need to figure out why, it is a command line tool to troubleshoot. There are graphical interfaces or tools that you can use to do this instead, but generally speaking, you're just going to be... The command line tool is always what I've used, so that's what I default to, and it's built in. You don't have to download anything. So repadmin is the tool that you would use, and I can do the same thing. I can do /help, or I can do /?, and it will show me all of my different options that I can use with this tool. Now, the ones that I've used quite a bit myself is you can trigger replication. You'd have to specify the destination and source DCs if you're doing this. You can do summary commands that show you the replication state of the environment, which is really useful. That's using either show REPL or REPL summary. Let's just do those commands both. I actually don't know the difference. I've used these kind of interchangeably and gotten different information. Also, we talked about the KCC. There's a /KCC command which tells Active Directory, recalculate your replication partners really quick, right? That's useful. So let's do repadmin REPL summary, and that shows us your source and destination. In this case, it also shows you how long it's been since that replication has occurred between those. So source, I don't know exactly how to interpret this, but we're seeing a 15-minute delay between this sort of stuff. So that's not an insignificant delay. But it shows this in a big environment. This will show all of your domain controllers. It'll show you your failures of what domain controllers are failing to replicate from where. It gives you some place to start and say, okay, now this appears based on my failures and my replication partners that this one domain controller is my problem. I can focus on troubleshooting that domain controller. Now, let's do the other command, which was show REPL. I felt like this data was basically the same. Oh, cool. So this shows that those partitions, if you remember from the DSRM Restore, we had 5 different partitions. It shows the status of each partition and the last attempted replication of it. and that's just showing the replication of ADP1 specifically. So that's this command. Really, all of these commands through /?, you can get a list of all of the different possible attributes that you can use or commands you can run. And this is designed not necessarily to fix the issue for you, but to help you narrow down and locate where is my problem at. If it's a specific DC and that DC is the only DC in the network, it's possible it's a problem with the DC itself, or it's a problem with the DC's network connection or something. But it helps you narrow down the focus so you know where to focus your troubleshooting efforts when it comes to replication data. It can be really useful. And that really is replication troubleshooting in a nutshell. I can't imagine they want you to know anything else for the exam objectives. So the last thing that we wanted to talk about, the last exam objective, is going to be what Microsoft has labeled troubleshoot on-premise Active Directory. It's a very vague objective. Could be encompass a lot of things. The way that I interpret that when you see a vague objective is there should be a tool that you use for doing or for starting all of your troubleshooting. It's going to be the same as this repadmin tool. Let me clear my console here. There is a command line tool called dcdiag that, when just run like this, gives you a really high level overview of your status of your Active Directory and any issues that it might find. Well, right there. I'm not on a directory server. So let's close this and switch over to our domain controller and rerun that. Okay, dcdiag. And it goes through and runs a whole bunch of tests that's evaluating your domain controller, and it will show you are there any events. This is checking event viewer for events that might cause issues. Obviously, it doesn't like something about the hard drives on this domain controller. That's fine. It is a chatty command, right? It's displaying a whole bunch of events related to that services, but you can see what it's testing. It tests the advertising, tests replication. This is evaluating the system log for those events. Scroll down. Verify references. It does a whole bunch of things, right? Now, that's just running the command. It gives you a whole bunch of information. It can help you identify stuff. I've definitely used this and gotten success in trying to identify problems and narrow down. You also have other switches that you can use. So let's show our help menu. This lists all of the different tests that it runs or that's available to run and description. So I've got a test for DNS, right? I've got a test for DC promo. Otherwise, if I scroll at the top, it's the different switches that are available. So display a help, test all the servers in the site. I can do a /C, which is a comprehensive test, or I can do let's see, fix, make safe repairs. I've never used that, so I don't know what that does. There is one to run specific tests, which, oh, right here, /test, right? Or /skip. So you can run all and then skip a specific test, or you can target one of these tests that's listed below to identify which ones you want to run. Now, let's try the comprehensive one, because that's a little bit more information than the default out-of-the-box test that it runs. So /C. This is going to run quicker because I'm in a small domain. Sometimes these tests can take a while to run and execute, especially if you're in a really large domain, because there's a lot more to check. In this case, you can see it's checking DNS. Specifically says it's not hung, meaning it expects this test to take a while. Spoiler alert, this test is going to fail. I kind of mentioned why earlier in the video, but this is, for a demonstration purpose, this works really well. Okay, our comprehensive test to run. You can see I'm ignoring the events viewer. The system log check isn't really useful because usually you can look at the system log yourself and find those things. But in this case, I tested DNS and it's showing me a whole bunch of error. It's missing SRV records. And notice my DNS server. Like I said, I set this domain controller to use a public DNS as backup. That was in case I lost connectivity. But because I did that, it's failing my dcdiag tests. So let's fix it really quick. Internet settings. Let's set our adapter specifically to the correct format. This is Azure, so I'm not going to mess with the DC reservation. But let's say I want to prefer my local host first. I'm going to use myself as a domain controller first, and then I'm going to use my other DC as my backup. Hit OK. Hit close. That's good. Now I'm testing against myself, and I'm testing against the other domain controller. Rather than me run the whole thing, look at our help menu. I want to check just my DNS test. That's what I felt. Or that's what I failed last time. So I have /test. So I'll do dcdiag /test :DNS to run just DNS test again. And let's see if we're passing now. Spoiler alert. Pretty sure we're going to pass. Bam. Cool. DNS pass, or Active Directory pass test DNS. So you'll notice also this is testing just this domain controller. I have the ability in dcdiag to target specific domain controllers, or just connect to the domain controller you want to test against in this case, and it will launch tests from that context. There also is the ability to test all servers, entire enterprise, or all the servers in this site using different switches, and that will run the test from one, switch to the next one, run the test from that one, next one, switch, run the test from that one. It's also useful if you're in PowerShell, rather than trying to view this in the command line, which can be kind of cumbersome. You can use out file, which will basically take all of the output from this result and say dcdiag.test. What that is that's taking my dcdiag command, which I could do this whatever switches I want, and then piping the output using PowerShell with out file to a text file, and that will just write and save any output from the command into that text file, and then you have a text file that you can work with and read. It's a little bit easier, especially running a lot of tests across all of your domain controllers. There's also a way to do this with, rather than using PowerShell. Whoops, I want to leave that because I don't want to type that again. Instead of using out file, you can just do dcdiag, and if I want to do like my DNS tests, you can use a caret. I'm pretty sure this also works. This is like a bat command or a command line, old school command to output a text file. So there's your options, and that is what I'm pretty sure Microsoft is referencing when they're saying troubleshoot on-premise Active Directory. That's it. That covers our Active Directory troubleshooting section. It went a little bit longer than I expected to, mostly probably because of that AD sites and services stuff and talking about replication. There's a lot more settings there that are accessible, and there's some nuance if you're actually managing some of the different replication details between sites. But I want to do a high-level overview because anytime you're talking about replication, Active Directory sites and services, that's such a big component of it. That's one of the main reasons you use it, on top of focusing domain traffic to its local domain controllers. Handling replication between sites is a big part. So I think it was worth going into and configuring that, and at least spending a little bit of time talking through it. Hopefully this was educational for you. My next video is going to be just doing the same monitoring and troubleshooting section of the exam, focusing on just the monitoring and alerting subtopic. So that will be next. I also have some videos that I'm backed up on from past exam objectives that I haven't gotten back around to recording yet. So more things will be coming up. If you have any questions about the stuff we talked about today, let me know in the comments or reach out to me directly, and I will do my best to follow up. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.